Hey folks, Steve here with another NATO The Cold War Goes hot video. This is a post-mortem for our beginner scenario, doing the Baltic approaches, the BALTAP scenario. And I'm doing this video separate from the playthrough because it just allows my brain to gel a little bit and to reflect rather than focus on just playing. Now I'll say, clearly this was a NATO victory, but not in large part due to any specific decision making on the part of NATO. Really, it came down to misplay as the Warsaw Pact, and I think I can kind of break down why, and it's a mistake that just begs to be executed against, but also learning, and I guess that's the important thing. So much of this is still connected to learning the system, learning what to do and not to do. And it does turn out that this scenario is pretty good at kind of, in a low stakes way, showing where you can screw up so that if you're going to go play the big campaign or any of the other campaigns in the game, you maybe learn some important lessons like when it is or is not worth moving beyond your main supply line to do the thing that you want to do. And I think that's really important in many games, and this is sometimes the case in like East Front World War II games, where sometimes, like as the Germans, you do want to run past your supply lines to do something. You can't wait for all the supply to catch up to you. Sometimes you just got to make a move. Um, and I think there's an element of that in here, especially as the Warsaw Pact, which is going to be on the offensive, I suspect, most of the time. In this scenario, there was really never a clear point where the NATO forces could counterattack in any real meaningful way. And I think you'd have to kind of arrange your NATO forces just right to even have, more than four combat power, attack power being sent against any particular Warsaw Pact unit. Um, and for that attack to even work, you'd really need that unit to have been already flipped, disrupted, possibly out of supply, that sort of thing, out of combat supply, to have any reasonable expectation of eliminating a step. So this really does come down to, I think, in terms of a puzzle, for the NATO player, you're just trying to get steps where you can get them, try to make it hard to traverse the terrain and be disruptive that way, where the Warsaw Pact player really has the burden to take the rules and create an actual operational plan of action, execute that, knowing how the rules work, in achieving your objectives. And the strategies that are available, I look at it and I go, okay, everybody wants to go after Copenhagen. Isn't that just the thing to do? And what you're really putting yourself at the mercy of there is the interception die rolls. And while we didn't have terrible interception die rolls to start, they got progressively worse, to the point where in these last couple of turns, those failures really just hurt us. It hurt us, via the flak. It hurt us, just any number of ways, in terms of what we were trying to achieve. And when you lose a lift command, when you lose a helicopter lift command, especially, and it's not like you have a lot of it in this particular scenario, that really hurts you long term. So, the earlier you lose those things, the worse it becomes. So we had put so much effort, into trying to get into Copenhagen that when it failed, and it, when you look at the beginning of the scenario, like, yeah, Copenhagen is not totally defenseless. It has reinforcements nearby. There's plenty of things that we need concern ourselves with, um, that could screw us up. So there's that element of it. Um, Now, I look at the map and I go, well, from the get go, right, is going after Copenhagen worthwhile? Well, we got our concentric attack off. Something else that we could have done, and I'm realizing, like, is there anything that would have kept me from doing this? I'm not certain that there is any real reason not to try it. We could have done unit here, and then maybe a unit. I'm sorry, a unit here and here. is there any reason not to do that? Well, the only thing you're really setting yourself up for failure there is if obviously you don't know if those units are going to land due to interception, but it would close off the ability for the Danish to kind of react into Copenhagen. So, a even going down the Copenhagen, however you want to pronounce it, even going after the capital strategy, there's a decision of how you want to drop those units, and do you take on a little more sporadic risk to get other units in other hexes, and then you can maybe have a better chance of just straight up attacking Copenhagen in the way that your second shot, your first shot, whichever, um, might work then, I guess. I don't know if you can keep reinforcements from getting in. And I think there are even other ways to make that work if you I don't know. Depending on how the dice rolls, I guess. That matters. Fate has a vote in here. But I do look at it now, having played it, and I go, I don't know that I would try the Copenhagen strategy again. I think it is much better to focus elsewhere, especially in the early phases, um, to do, I guess it's like the operational deep strike on Copenhagen, or a more tactical combined arms operation at the neck of Denmark, um, which I think, and I suppose I could play through this, but I don't think I'm going to. I'll try to apply this in the next scenario that I play that will include this front. Um, Maybe much better to try and do an insertion um, near, and I'm going to get Flensburg. To do something at Flensburg, it's much closer, and you're going to be more likely to quickly put an air cover, making it contested air, not long after, if you can take the hex. Um, so when you think about, like, okay, here's the intro, and here's your reaction move. So the Germans are really down here, and Flensburg's maybe open. Well, instead of dropping 6 units around Copenhagen, maybe you're trying to drop 6 units in and around this area. You get the HQ on the coast, um, and you try to take Flensburg. And if you can take Flensburg, what's really important, I learned through the play, was that if you've got enemy units there, well, hell or high water, they've kind of got to get around the neck. They've either got to try to bypass it, and they're spending movement points on leaving Zox and entering Zox and this, that, and the other, um, or they just have to take it. And of course, even having one unit in there forces everybody to stop, forces everyone to kind of slow down and get resolved and get taken care of. Where if we had focused that same amount of effort down here, we would have less steps to worry about potentially, and we'd have a better chance to actually just take that city. Then the airborne troops, and keeping in mind, like, we would have to drop the Marines here, the paratroopers here, maybe even have to wait a turn to get the Marines to step forward and then do the attack. So there's a little bit of operational funkiness there due to the Marines, but you could still do various things, maybe even spread out your airdrops to get that concentric attack. You could do that, take that city. While that's going on, your in supply units using the East German front HQ can fight in here, do what it needs to do, but you're already holding the line, so that by the time you care about sending your armor forward and your mechanized infantry, we have that lull that we experienced where our HQs are being swapped out. And if you spend your combat supply and you move too far forward, like I did, you find yourself in a situation where you're having to kind of wait. But what you could do if you were taking Flensburg first, with your air we'll say your air mobile units and everything else in Marines, you clean this up, you're still in supply while your HQs are changing out. Your units don't need to bump up against Flensburg, and they can carry their combat supply that they would still have with them through here, right? And now we don't maybe have as much in the way of Zocs. Maybe the NATO forces have tried to put some Zocs or units right here, but these guys can come forward, clear that with their armor units, and then have their mechanized units in reserve move forward and be in a position to assault this city and be able to push beyond it. Um, Meanwhile, NATO's scrambling to try to get these units that were on this island um, over the ferry to this location. So, like, you can already see, like, I'm describing a much better way to have tried to handle this scenario. But because I put so much effort into going to Copenhagen, it wasn't going to work. It just wasn't going to work. So I've learned a lot now, even with the rules, to say like, okay, I could have gone about this a bit differently. Now it would still probably have been a tight fight because now we really are having to smash our way across this bridge here. We're really having to fight. Now all these guys could kind of start to move, so we've got to deal with that. We probably still want to drop chemical strikes once we're in range because we want to be able to slow these units down, and that's what the chemical strikes will help to do. And then maybe in the late game you do something sneaky and you go after Copenhagen if the NATO forces have left their chins sticking out and have diverted too many forces. Well, maybe if your lift commands are still there and your airborne troops are okay, well, they were busy taking Flensburg. Well, now you use them again, right? And you use them to do a drop operation more locally from this path rather than just jumping out in the middle of enemy airspace. They have some air support, air zone coverage, contested air rather than just enemy airspace, and they can do more localized drops. And you can imagine again, dropping a bunch of units outside this city or that city and maintain pressure while the rest of the mechanized and armor forces catch up. So already sounds like, gosh, if I played this scenario again, I think I would be much more competent. The Warsaw Pact forces would be operating with a much more coherent game plan, where it took this failure, I think, to understand how I would want this to operate. And so as we get into whatever the next scenario I'm going to play will be, I'm going to bring those lessons with me, and we would probably see the Denmark area of this map and the end result be very different by turns 5, 6, or 7 than where we're at right now, which is really a poor showing. But the lessons have been learned, and how I can try to make all of this work is much more clear to me. How do I want to succeed? What do I want to be doing? It makes a lot more sense at the moment than it did at the beginning, which was, hey, how would I do a helicopter movement here? What's the right way to make this work? How do I ensure that my supply works? Oh, okay, I've got to kind of wait a turn while my guys wait for an HQ to show up. Well, I could have done that just a little bit differently if I had focused effort elsewhere. All those things can start to matter quite a bit. And I'm pretty pleased with the process of learning how to work this. Now, there's certainly rules that we haven't used yet that would affect other scenarios, especially the War of Nerves, which has its own things. But just the pure operational cadence of how the game works, I think the scenario did provide a really good learning space where you do have to use combined arms. You are, at least in my case, leveraging things like the chemical strikes, so you get an appreciation for these extra strike capabilities that are not just based on air power, and that your air mobile capability can be really important to set up local tactical encirclements and concentric attacks, or flank attacks if you can't get a full concentric. So overall, I'm pleased with the introductory scenario. I think it is really good for learning, and I do suspect that if you stumble your way through learning, and then you're going to be willing to play it again, I'm just going to move on to a bigger scenario. But if you were playing this, I could see where, hey, you do what I did, you learn a lot of mistakes. Then in your second go around, it becomes a much more contested scenario because you're taking these lessons learned and you're trying to tackle this problem of conquering Denmark in a very different way. And obviously, that opens up other strategies for the NATO player because, hey, if I'm not as focused on Copenhagen, I've got some space to learn how to defend in depth by putting units in front of each other, um, and ensuring that uh, I'm covering cities in a way that don't leave them open to really easy concentric attack situations and all of that. So solid learning scenario. I definitely have realized my failures, and what I should have been trying to do with those air points. But obviously, going after Copenhagen, that's such a draw. You want to take the capital. Um, but to me, it seems clear those resources are probably better spent doing something else. I'm sure I would come across cons in the process of executing that alternate strategy. It just seems like there's maybe no perfect answer, but less risk involved of going after an empty Flensburg than Copenhagen, and that seems like a really easy get, right? You're not even sending your forces too far forward. They're just going here. Your main operators are here. They can, get protected reasonably quickly, and then you're trying to squeeze past this tight spot. And even if NATO is really trying to block this, you have enough combat factors, and again, all the support of air and this, that, and the other, that in the open, you should be able to crack any sort of defensive line there that NATO could put together because none of the NATO units are particularly strong. Some of those hard Danish units have a 2 combat strength, but and then one of the British units has a 2 defense strength. But those units are not going to stand up to attacks that are going to involve 24 attack factors, something like that. They're going to be rolling very well. They're going to be clearing hexes reasonably easily. Um, so that definitely seems like a better strategy. So if you're going to play this scenario for the first time after watching this video, I would maybe say give the 4 minor cities as your strategy from the get go, a try. Do that. Don't go for the trap of trying to go after Copenhagen. I mean, you could maybe make it work, and if you were able to make it work, that's a big deal. But if you even look at my game map, had I taken Copenhagen, I still don't know that I'd be that much better off because you still have to get 2 more minor cities, and I could have better used some of my operating capability to shorten the time frame we were stuck right here. So that's certainly one big element of this. Probably worth mentioning as well that um, I think in some of our combats, I may have forgotten to, in one combat involving the British, I forgot to double the soft unit in the city. Um, so that's one thing that I just sort of screwed up. I didn't mention it in the playthrough, but that would have been maybe one more thing I didn't account for that slowed down the Soviets. I think it's a really interesting problem. Like cities can be really um, difficult to take for that reason. The other thing that I did poorly was in our attack on Flensburg, I kind of tried to rush out to do it, and I was attacking with armor units into a city. So, like, despite these big, beefy units, their actual attack ability going into it was so severely reduced. And so, one other element that the Warsaw Pact player has to balance is these really strong armor units that yeah, if they're in supply and they're full strength, these big divisions, attacking a city with other units is great. It's fine. Attacking by themselves, it's just tougher. They get such a reduction on their attack strength. And if you roll poorly or you get hit with a NATO airstrike, like, yeah, armor by itself trying to take a city is going to have plenty of problems. So you're balancing that against the combat strength of your mechanized infantry, but unfortunately, they tend to be a little bit slower than your armor. So I think there is still something to the ability for the Soviet armor to bypass cities or at least get around Zox and be willing to operate kind of off the supply track um, or off the main supply line, but they do so with some you know some risk. And those mechanized infantry are really great, but they aren't going to be they're not going to be perfect, right? That's one element of it. As I started to get further into the playthrough, I kept thinking about the fact that like the armor is good for clearing the open hexes, right? That's obvious. And then the mechanized infantry also being hard units, but the fact that they're not armor means that they weren't have attacking cities. So when you're trying to figure out like, okay, what am I trying to conserve in terms of steps? Where do I not want to take losses? The mechanized infantry in this scenario feel, I think, a lot more important than even the armor, because that armor is just going to get so much weaker trying to attack those cities, and that's how you're going to get victory. So if, let's say, you get lucky in some airstrikes as NATO and you eliminate any of the mechanized infantry or reduce them by a step, um, all of a sudden the actual oomph that the Warsaw Pact needs to take cities is dramatically reduced. So in terms of a strategy, like, yeah, the armor is really there to help support the mechanized infantry, either to clear enemy hexes outside of the cities, to provide concentric attack bonuses, to add some combat attack power into assaults on cities, certainly. So still a lot of value for the armor, fast movers laying down Zocs, but the key kind of crown jewel element of the Warsaw Pact forces here on the Baltic front really are those mechanized infantry. So I would say, if you're the NATO player and you find yourself in an opportunity where you still have an airstrike that you can hit an enemy with, because you didn't use it as reaction, or I guess when you're doing reaction, like who are you going to hit? Um, I think you almost always are going to want to try to target that mechanized infantry, and so that would certainly be one tip. If you're the NATO player and you're able to give a step loss to the Warsaw Pact, I'd probably prioritize hitting that mechanized infantry. You don't want those pretty reasonably strong units from being able to get into a city. And they're strong enough that even on a step loss, if they take the city, they can hold the city. They've got good defense ratings as well, these big divisions, mechanized infantry divisions. So wherever possible, you want that strike. You want to be able to hit them in where you've got bonuses to your airstrikes and trip them down. So long as you can deal a few steps, that might be enough that they just don't have the oomph to get any further on the map. And that's probably the only thing that NATO can really try to do. They're really stuck just reacting and defending and positioning units. But wherever they can actually dish out damage, that's a number one priority, I feel. Maybe the Warsaw Pact player can do some Hail Mary things in the last turns with their armor to try to take whatever's left, but the big combat power for the combats that really really matter are going to come from those mechanized infantry. So, anything else? I think there's a fair amount of rereading of the rules I had to do as it came to doing helicopter movement and just understanding like when and how can I move units around. The distinction between um, what is considered like, I'll say, lift movement. I'll just call it lift movement for lack of a cohesive game term. Or I guess it's just considered air and sea movement and helicopter movement, whatever. Non ground movement. If you're not in enemy airspace, it's ferrying, and you can just kind of move stuff around, and that's convenient. If it's in contested airspace, and you're not trying to do a big combat operation, um, that's reasonably safe, but you can still get intercepted. So you want to be careful about doing those kind of lifts in enemy territory because there is always some risk. And then you have the actual like you know insertion, which is going into enemy airspace and trying to make something happen, and that's obviously much more dangerous, and you're much more liable to failure in losing units. So it's just interesting trying to get in your head like, You don't need lift commands if it's in very safe territory. So that's sort of your strategic movement or quick movement for those air mobile units or marine units, I guess. You still have to use lift commands as soon as that enemy airspace makes it contested. So as soon as you start hitting contested, and that can change quickly, like, you could all of a sudden the city is now in contested airspace. Now you can't just get it in there for free as NATO, and you might actually lose it. That's something you need to think about. So when the Soviets start coming, if you're trying to get some forces moved somewhere, you either got to do it very quickly, and I probably could have done a better job with that, or you're going to be taking risks in contested airspace. And then, obviously, what we had to do is the Warsaw Pact. If you're using your helicopters, you're using your other units to try to get into enemy airspace, enemy territory, that's even worse. But that maybe is where you do some really surprising operational deep strikes that could have really big game effects. So you're going to be balancing all those things. And what I think is what adds to all of this is not just the ability to do the lift commands and the helicopter movement, but it does mean that, like, on map, you are counting the hexes and checking supply to validate, where is the airspace. So while the game does not have this really deep, point combat, plane versus plane air system, your concept of airspace is a huge factor in terms of what you can do, what you're going to try to do, what's your range of influence such that you can launch different types of attacks or use your tactical chemical strike capability. It is about that airspace. It is about where your units are at, such that you have your command and control capabilities, influenced by where your units are at. That in part changes your operational capability, and I like that. So while it's not as in depth as other systems in terms of managing the air war, the elements are there enough that you do feel it's a meaningful contribution to your planning. You move out here. Well, now that's contested airspace. Now that's when you're willing to drop paratroopers. Your helicopter, you're close enough now that you can send a helicopter around, maybe avoid some Zocs so you don't have as much flak. Once you're within a certain range, all those things start to come together, and that has felt very nice. So I've appreciated that. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with the game experience so far. Besides the markers, which I've already mentioned, the markers kind of annoy me, but if not for that, there's nothing else really bad to say about my game experience so far. So I think what I'm going to do to make, I guess, my time most valuable, the next video I'm going to do for this game is the War of Nerves scenario. So I was going to maybe just do like strategic surprise or something, and then do War of Nerves. But given War of Nerves is variable, we could end up with a strategic surprise situation. We could accidentally end up in an extended buildup situation, or some granular, a gradient in between there somewhere. I'm going to do War of Nerves first, which means I'm going to have to prepare those rules in my brain and understand how the War of Nerves stuff works. But we're going to play that. And then if we get a strategic surprise in the outcome of the pre-war mechanics, then I'll be more incentivized to try a extended build-up as a third campaign, or a third playthrough, if I'm going to do one at all. I'm not sure, but I think War of Nerves just makes a lot of sense to do first, and then we can always try to experience what we missed out on later. Whatever we don't get out of the sneakies of the Warsaw Pact preparing to launch their offensive. So that's what we're going to do next, guys. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be very interesting, very fun. So we'll see you in the next one for that. Take care, keep gaming. Hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you in the next one.